嗨，各位线上的观众，欢迎回到现场哦。很不容易，大家都从早上一路跟我们一起看这个微软的线上技术峰会的直播。那我们现在即将进入今天早上的最后一场。那最后一场，我想大家谈的其实是大家尤其是开发者们绝对不陌生的 GitHub。那我们这一场会听到 Michael Francisco， 也就是来自 GitHub 的 Michael Francisco 来我们分享 GitHub 最新的进展，还有 GitHub 怎么在企业里面做应用。我们看 Michael 分享。
Hello, my name is Michael Francisco. I lead developer marketing for GitHub. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you about GitHub, about open source, about developer velocity and intersourcing, and how all of these things come together to help you deliver better innovation to your customers. A little bit about myself. I live just outside of Seattle, Washington, and currently at home with my family in isolation. If you hear noises outside the door while I'm talking, just know that that's my family and it's probably highly expected. If there's any questions you have after the presentation, I'll provide my contact information at the end, and please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to continue the discussion and help in any way that we can. Thank you.
So today we're going to talk about open source, intersource, and developer velocity. The structure of this conversation is we're going to start a little bit talking about open source and open source growth in the greater Chinese region. We're going to talk a little bit about what we can learn from open sourcing and how that contributes to this philosophy and culture and approach that we call intersourcing. We're going to talk about intersourcing, define it, come to a common agreement on what intersourcing is, what it means, and then talk about what does it mean to actually be effective at implementing intersource within your organization and why you would want to do that. All of this accrues to developer velocity. Developer velocity is a concept and a idea that we talk a lot about, which is really focused on how do we help developers do their best work? How do we empower them in a way that makes the environment that they work in more collaborative? How do we keep them focused on the tasks and code that's really important to them and that keeps them engaged both internally and as part of their contributions to the open source community? And then also, how do we think about really freeing them up to focus on those pieces of your code that differentiate you from the rest of the market? Developer velocity is an important concept and one that I think this whole conversation today accrues to, and we'll talk more about as we go through. Let's start a little bit talking about open source in the greater Chinese region. GitHub is a global community, but 80% of developers on GitHub live outside of the United States. This chart here shows the size of the developer communities relative to the whole around the world. As you can see, China is the second largest developer community on GitHub. They make up about 14% of the total platform. And while being a big portion of the community, they're also a very active part of the community. Chinese developers in the last year made over 5.5 million contributions through GitHub to software. And so it's important to note that not only is this a growing community, but it's an active community, and we're really excited to see this development and growth over time. If we get a little bit more discrete and talk about just APAC, China makes up about 34% of the developers in APAC. About 34% of those are Chinese developers on GitHub. Again, it's a great growth and great story about how active this community is. And when we talk about growth, I'm going to throw a number out at you. This number is 37%. 37% is the growth rate of the community the developer community over the last 12 months on GitHub in China. For context, this is the fastest growth rate in the world, faster than even the United States that came in at 22%. And the United States has the world's largest developer base locally. So if you think about that, it's growing faster than the United States with the smaller developer community. We're really excited to continue to see this growth in China in their participation in open source. And we take a look at some other countries that are in the greater Chinese region. As you can see, Hong Kong is, for the second year in a row, the fastest growing region in the world by percentage of increase in contributors at 175% growth year over year. This is general contributions to software through GitHub. And as you can see, it's far and beyond the number 2 entry, Singapore, and it's a great mark that they've been able to do this for 2 consecutive years. If we talk about the growth in open source contributors, so these are developers that are contributing to open source code specifically, Hong Kong again comes in at the top of the list, but we started seeing other folks in here as well. Taiwan is also in the top 10 as we look at this group. So it's exciting to see just kind of the general impact and growth of open source contributors and communities within GitHub, within the Greater Chinese region. When we look at the importance of open source code, and we want to talk a little bit about why it's important that we're seeing such great contribution to open source from the communities in the Greater Chinese region. Part of that is that open source plays a very significant and important role in the software development world at large. To highlight that point, I want to call out that 99% of projects, this is all software projects that have over 1,000 lines of code in them, have at least one open source dependency within them. And if we look on average across all software that has open source in them, or every software project, and you look at the dependencies that support those projects, on average, open source projects have over 150 dependencies, open source dependencies as part of a single project. So you start accruing this. It's not just one piece of open source software that's sitting in these code bases. It's one piece of open source software supported by over 100 different open source dependencies that kind of bring that project together. So you start thinking about the broad implications of all of these projects coming together to bring this one dependency into a code base. It's a great kind of global effort from the developer community to make this sort of work possible. And it really is a demonstration of how the community and the work the community does is a great example of the world's largest team sport. We couldn't do these things individually, but the community together has figured out how to get it done, and it's an important contribution to the world of software development. Take this a step further. If you look at the modern software supply chain, 80 to 90% of the code comes from open source. This means that the average modern software code base is made up of 80 to 90% of open source components. That means that from a differentiation standpoint, the differentiation between one software project, one code base, and another really exists in that 10 to 20% of proprietary code. And you think about being able to develop software in a way that kind of makes you an innovator in your space, or really kind of drives those very unique, very enjoyable, very delightful customer experiences. By taking your same developers and focusing them on that 10 to 20% of code, you're really allowing them to focus on the stuff that really, really matters instead of reinventing the wheel. You're taking those resources that might previously have been spent kind of rebuilding things, NPM libraries and things like that your developers would need in order to deliver that kind of last mile piece of software to customers. Now we can work with the open source community to bring those pieces in, leverage the strength of the community and hundreds and thousands of hours of development already completed, bring that into your project and allow your developers to think about and focus on those pieces of their proprietary code that really differentiate you from the competition. While the contribution of dependencies and source components and software to these broader projects is really important, it's not the only thing that we can glean and take away from open source. One of the things that we can gain from open source is learning. We can take and learn from the fact that open source is a distributed community of developers that work together to build important software. They figured out how to work effectively, asynchronously, across languages and across time zones to come together to build very important, very complex, essential pieces of software used by the rest of the world. These communities, while they maybe not have ever met in person, are efficient, they're organized, they don't share an office, nor do they share an IT department, but somehow they've managed to figure out how to share, reuse, code, and harness the skills of their peers to get work done. As we think about the modern software team, it's really important to be able to look at how have these groups organically been able to organize themselves, take those learnings and bring them inside of your development teams. Whether your developers are sitting 5 feet, 10 feet apart, or they're sitting half a world apart, they suffer from some of the same challenges the open source community suffered, understanding how to really work together and break down silos so that their best work could get done and the best skills could be leveraged in the right situations, and they weren't repeating work. Instead, they were using the work each other was doing to build on top of it, springboard into that next project, and really advance software development as a practice. So what is intersourcing? I want to take a moment to pause and talk about what is intersourcing. As a definition, intersourcing takes the lessons learned from developing open source software and applies them to the ways that companies develop software internally. full stop. When we think about intersourcing, this is the definition that GitHub uses to think about what it means to be effective at intersourcing, what it means to target an intersourcing project. It's about learning from the open source community, bringing those practices inside your organization, and implementing them in an effective way that helps your developers expand and increase their velocity, while also helping you innovate faster and deliver better experiences to your customers. So how do we do this, and what are the problems that we're solving for? We'll talk about that. Let's take a step backwards for a second. It should be clear to everybody by now that developers are at the core of innovation. Developers and developer talent is the key to helping us unlock innovation at scale, and are key to actually delivering great value to our customers. In order to empower our developers and allow them to do their best work, we've had to solve some problems in the way organizations are organized. When we started about 10 years ago, DevOps became a topic, and DevOps was really a focus on how do we remove the barriers between our development teams and the operation teams that spun up the environments they needed to build, test, and deploy software. DevOps was an effort to bring these groups together to simplify that process, provide more consistency for developers, and put them in better control in the environments they needed to go do their best work. As we think about DevOps, there's kind of 4 key practices that we talk about. One of them is collaboration. GitHub is the home for developer collaboration. We were a platform that was built from the start as focused on solving the problem of allowing a distributed team of folks working on a very complex software project to be able to work asynchronously. We are the home of the pull request and the GitHub flow, and kind of the way that this pull request workflow that developers love works. And this notion of social coding was born out of GitHub and this desire to solve this collaboration problem. And everything that we've invested in on the platform over time has really been focused on simplifying collaboration. The next piece of this is workflows and automation, establishing consistent patterns and pathways for developers to do their work, and then automating that, taking away the manual time that they spend pushing buttons or to start a new process or moving code around. Through workflow automation, we've taken those manual tasks away and given time back to developers to focus on writing code and solving real challenging problems that they find enjoyable and that they find challenging and useful for the business. Security and compliance, working security and compliance into your workflows and understanding how to simplify the process of managing not only security within your code base, but managing the security that's related to the dependencies that you're pulling from the open source community, being able to more accurately identify those vulnerabilities and their variants, and also being able to quickly remediate problems that you've identified or that might be coming in through an open source dependency. Understanding your security and compliance workflows and being good at quickly identifying and remediating is a key practice for DevOps. And finally, continuous improvement. Being able to leverage all of these practices to kind of provide the ability to do continuous integration on your code instead of moving from biannual shipments of software, being able to ship multiple times a day, and thinking about how we're continuously rapidly iterating to improve our code base and then improve our processes that allow us to ship and deliver code. All 4 of these are key practices that help move organizations forward. The challenge with all of this is that despite the fact that a lot of folks understand this and they invest in DevOps, we know that 93% of DevOps implementations are not optimized, meaning that organizations that have invested money in DevOps are not seeing the returns that they could or should be seeing out of those investments, and therefore are not seeing the returns in relative to speed of delivery, security, or kind of innovation on the back end. And the reason for that is that DevOps alone is not enough. You can't just put tools and systems in place and expect it to fix all of your development challenges. No matter how many tools and systems you put in place, your organizations are still working in silos. You can put people together, close together physically, or you can put them on Slack all day long, but there's still breakdowns between organizations that need to be working together to learn from each other. And that's not just small developer teams, we're talking across your organization. I want to illustrate this as an example for you. This is what your organization might look like, or a small part of your organization. And oftentimes organizations struggle from the concept of Conway's Law. Conway's Law is organizations which build systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of those organizations. So if your ability to communicate within your organization follows the structure of your organization, you are naturally not allowing your organization to communicate or work together as smoothly as they possibly could. This might be how it works for you. Your organization is broken into units, and within a given unit, it's easy to communicate. But what happens when you need to collaborate outside of that unit? It might look something like this, where you have this kind of convoluted communication chain, and it makes it difficult for folks to be able to actually communicate and do the work they need to do, and the people that are valuable relative to skills or experience or knowledge might be left out of that loop. And then if you try to bring that person in, something gets lost in the translation. And how does collaboration happen in this environment? Well, the truth is it truly can't. And you can work harder, you can try to do unnatural things to drive communication, but this structure of an organization relative to how communication happens in Conway's Law makes it difficult for you to get kind of big changes and big returns on those collaborating events. What happens then if you have a much larger organization and you have 3 people that need to figure out how to work together because they have similar interests in either knowledge or the problems that they're trying to solve? The ability to collaborate across those groups, be able to find each other, be able to learn from the work that they're all doing is nearly impossible. So we need to figure out a way to figure out how to solve this organizational distancing and bring developers closer together, bring their work closer together so that we can help them collaborate more effectively. Again, this is the problem that the open source community has naturally solved in order to help it continue to develop software that the world is leveraging to help move their own software projects forward. So let's talk for a minute about how this happens. What are the things that we need to do in order to effectively introduce intersourcing into our organization and solve some of the challenges that we were talking about? We're talking a minute about intersourcing fundamentals. There are 4 goals of intersourcing that we want to really focus on. One is we want to focus on reuse. We want to reuse the code and the knowledge that is happening within one part of your organization in another part of your organization. If you have a team that has built a specific component that's unique to your code base, you don't want another team to be building that same component. You want to be able to share those things. You want to be able to provide the access to that code in a secure manner so that code that needs to be locked down because of PII or compliance restrictions, or whatever that might be, you want to be able to share that appropriately across your organization so people feel free to share code openly and be able to use it in their various projects without having to recreate the wheel. The second piece is collaboration. We want to encourage collaboration across your organization, solving for the problem that we just talked about, not reducing that organizational distance to bring people closer together to work on code together and bring their shared and unique insights to these projects. We want to build community. We want people to work together and celebrate that working together, learn from each other's successes and learn from each other's failures, and come together as a community to celebrate that and share it so that we're constantly all getting better based upon the work of our peers. And finally, the last goal is to, as I mentioned earlier, really increase developer velocity. Allow people to get to that state where they're moving as fast as they want to, being able to focus on those projects that are interesting to them, and really bringing up developer satisfaction, which in turn results in better work, faster work, and greater innovation for your customers. In the end, the goal is to build better software faster. As we think about open source, or intersourcing, taking the open source learnings and applying them to your organization through intersourcing, there's kind of 5 things that I think are important for us to consider as we look at bringing intersourcing into your organization. The first one is that you want to create an open environment. You want to create a level playing field for the open sharing of work. You want to create transparency. You want to ensure that the process as well as the product is visible to folks as they're working through their projects. You want to make a participative environment, make it easier for others to collaborate together. Again, reducing that organizational distancing. We want it to be collaborative, increase quality by increasing quantity, people working together, sharing their code, sharing their work, and all kind of building upon each other in an exponential way to help drive greater change, faster iteration, and more frequent ships that result in value to your customers. And lastly, you want to think about it being governed. You can't do any of this without having some governance over the process. You don't want to create a wild, chaotic environment, but what you want to do is put in enough controls, clear goals, and support to help your organizations apply these tenets in a way that really drives towards a consistent goal, keeps your company within compliance, and allows you to have some structure while driving this collaboration and this intersourcing. So let's dive into each of these just a little bit. First one is open. As we think about open, what does this mean? Well, first, in repositories, it's being able to find prior art, and that prior art isn't possible to be found if it's not open in the first place. So we need to make sure we're opening up our repositories in a thoughtful way. We want to reuse as much as possible. This could be an argument for more microservices. Well, that's a whole other conversation. But we want to be able to be people to reuse pieces and components of code that others have built so they don't have to recreate the wheel. And lastly, you want to be able to have contributions. Forking workflows can be cumbersome, so you want to avoid it if you can, but you want to give people permissions with protections to be able to leverage, to be able to create branches, be able to leverage those branches to improve on them and use them in other projects. You want to make sure that you're governing that in the right way, and you want to be able to make sure that you're opening up the organization for contributions from others who can add value to projects. Transparent. You want to ensure that the process as well as the product is visible. Being able to see the description of how something like a deployment process works is great. It's a valid documentation. This is valid documentation beyond just explaining what a function does, but the communication about how a feature was made, that's important too. Take this example. Somebody makes the comment, we should switch over to MySQL. The response is, we tried that earlier and it didn't work. The response, okay. There's something that's missing here. This is not the way that communication should happen, because without the transparency, people don't understand why that decision was made and may either then dismiss it and lose sight of a valuable learning, or they might not have the context they need to make their own decision for their own organization. This is what it should look like. I want to switch to MySQL. We tried that. And by the way, take a look at this GitHub issue that explains why we made this decision. User reads. Now they have context for why that decision is made, and they can make an educated decision about how that decision was made and whether or not it applies to their organization, or if there's something they can learn from that helps influence their decision in a meaningful way so that they can make the right business decision. So transparency, not just about the product, but also about the process, is super important for helping make sure that we're sharing information in the right way. And finally, development. We want to make sure the process as well as product is visible, but this one is also about pull requests and code review. We want to collaborate while the code is being written, surface concerns early, and reduce the churn. This is what GitHub was built for, being able to create pull requests to make suggestions and comments within code that can quickly be merged back into the branch so that developers can work together asynchronously to make sure they're all kind of providing their input and building the best software possible with the right checks through their CI/CD workflows to make sure that everything works as it's intended before it gets deployed to the customer. So this is great. We've got a lot of new information if we're opening up repositories and giving people access. But just because people have a lot of information doesn't mean they can magically now participate in the process. In order to be effectively participative, we need to think about the roles of individuals within the organization, similar to the way we think about them in the open source community. At the top end of this funnel, we should think about this as kind of a transparency funnel, being able to share the right information with the right folks at the right levels of the organization. As we think about this funnel, think about this in the context of open source community. This funnel is really small at the bottom where we have our open source maintainers or maintainers of specific projects within your organization. This is usually just a handful of people, handful of experts that have the ability to make the final decision about what gets included in the code that they want to publish. A layer above this is the contributors. These are people that are actually writing code, creating pull requests, writing suggested changes and things like that actually improve the code that the maintainers then decide what goes into the final shipment. And above this is the users. These are the people that use this code. They might reuse it as a dependency. They might make suggestions, but they're probably not contributors. But this is a much broader set of folks. At each of these layers, there's a different level of transparency that is required in order to effectively allow these people to work. For the users, we want to make sure it's a low barrier to entry for these folks in terms of discovery. Make it easy, sometimes with dashboards or projects, as well as installation of the project. We want to make it easy for them to get the base level information they need to be able to install and use the product effectively, and then create a feedback loop where they can provide information and feedback back to the contributors and maintainers who are taking responsibility for improving on the project over time. You want to make it easier for others to collaborate together. For contributors, they're doing things like opening issues, improving docs, offering insight and conversation, unsolicited improvements, and working on backlogs. Ultimately, you want to reduce the friction required to submit feedback, get up and running, make sure things are even working, and finding ways to contribute. Then you'll have more contributors, and you'll have a much more engaging relationship with the community and a larger number of folks contributing to the success of your projects. And the last one is the maintainers. You want to make it easy for others to collaborate and reduce the friction, and that is done by the maintainers. These maintainers set the vision, document some process. They set, maintain the tone on conversations, they approve, they collaborate, they deny submissions from contributors, and they facilitate the shared ownership of the project. The maintainers are the ones that set the vision, they understand what the project should be focused on, and they're ultimately the ones that have the great responsibility of deciding what's in and what's out. They also have the responsibility of managing and encouraging and exciting this community to keep them engaged, and it's important to know what role everybody falls in. So as you think about this in the context of your organization, establishing guidelines for who are your maintainers, who are your contributors, and who are your users are super important to make sure that we have the right workflow supporting these projects. The tenet of being collaborative. Within our organizations, I think about this in the context of informal teams. We have structured teams, but I think it's also important to have informal teams. And these teams are important because they can work together to solicit help, learn from others, and they can develop expertise. And let's look at an example of how this might flow out. Here's the traditional engineering team. You have Dev Group A, Dev Group B, Dev Group C, and these folks are all working together to drive towards a specific goal, a specific project, a specific product, a specific innovation, whatever that thing might be. These folks are organized to work together. But then we have these teams with a common interest, and we call these ad hoc teams. So these are folks that maybe sit within each of these groups, but they have a specific interest in JavaScript. These are your JavaScript developers, and you want to have an ad hoc team where these folks can come together, share best practices, and learn from each other and work together. You might also have an organizational security team. So these are the folks that within these teams are focused on application security, or they're focused on compliance, whatever that project might be. You want to be able to connect those folks across the organization as well. You might also have folks who are interested in SQL, so thinking about database best practices. You might have these people sitting in multiple ad hoc teams because they share these interests, but it's really important to be able to find a way to connect these groups and allow them to collaborate outside of the structure of their organization to bring the learnings across teams and make your entire development organization stronger. You might have somebody who reports to Dev Group A and part of security and SQL teams. Really, this is about their expertise and empowering them to be important parts of the broader organization. This is not only good from the context of making sure that you're sharing information, but also in terms of having happy developers. Developers that can share their expertise, share their knowledge, and share their understanding of how things work, and then learn from each other are happier developers. And happier developers are developers that are easier to retain, and happier developers are those developers that are doing their best work most efficiently. And lastly, let's talk about the governed tenet. So this last piece is around policies and procedures. Maintainers focus on this aspect primarily. Good projects should have a way of reporting issues and how to contribute. This is sort of like documentation, but not about the code or the process of using the tool, but helping that along. So helping understand what are the rules, how should people contribute, and what's the code of conduct that people should be engaging in this project with. And the last piece of this is enforcement. We want to reduce the missteps by providing clear goals and support, and then we want to be able to make sure that there's some enforcement of those rules as well. A lot of the policies and procedures are enforced by the maintainers, or they're automated. There should be coordinated and well-defined roles for the user, for the contributor, for the core committer, for the mentor. Stewardship of the community for these projects, if they're big enough, is important and should be in the hands of the maintainers. So as you think about rolling projects internally into an inner-sourced model, again, putting the power of the maintainer in the hands of a core group of folks who are at the end of the day highly responsible for the project that are important to your organization, giving them the chance to establish the governance principles and enforce those, whether they be through manual processes or enforced through workflows that enforce specific areas of compliance or security testing. Really giving them this power is important. So I want to take a second to kind of look at the benefits of intersourcing. So we've talked about kind of what intersourcing is, and we've talked about what it takes to implement intersourcing well. Here's some companies that have done it, and I'm not going to read all of this to you. It doesn't matter. You can read it yourself. But these are big companies who have figured out how to leverage intersourcing within their organization, and they've seen great returns from just simple investment in intersourcing. And I say a simple investment, but I'm kind of misleading you. It's not simple. Intersourcing isn't, as I said before, just simply about tools or about processes. It's a combination of things that come together to enable your organization to work most effectively and work in a way that makes a lot of sense and keeps your developers happy. At the highest level, it's about culture. And this is a really important point because intersourcing is about culture. It's not about, as I said, tools or processes or talent. It's about establishing a culture supported by the right tools and processes that empowers your developer talent to collaborate, iterate faster, ship more frequently, and stay in flow. And flow is a concept we haven't talked much about here today, but it's an interesting concept that essentially means that the more time your developer spends in a creative frame of mind, the more creative they can be and the more work they're going to get done faster, and the better the quality of that work is going to be. Oh, and by the way, it's not always easy to get into that flow state. So once you're there, you want them to stay there. And so this culture helps your developers get into that state of flow and stay in that state of flow as long as they possibly can. So while we're talking about culture, I also want to make sure it's really important to know that it starts at the top. This isn't a bottoms-up thing. You can't go out and ask your developers to start intersourcing. This has to be something that starts at the top of your organization. It is a mandate. It is a set of beliefs and philosophies around building software that must be shared down through the organization and supported with a fervor at the top and through all of the management chains all the way down through your developers. Culture doesn't happen in pockets. Culture happens across the organization. And if you're a leader of a development team or an organization that has developer teams in it, know that intersourcing and the ability to do this effectively starts with you. And here's some of the things that should be a part of this culture. Culturally, you should want to share, reuse, collaborate, learn, and automate. These should be all parts of how you think about building software. They should be kind of core to the way that you build, core to the way that you work, and ingrained in the minds of everybody in your team. Believe it or not, building these habits and these thoughts into how your developers work is probably less of a challenge than you think, because if they're already out working with GitHub and working on open source, this is how they're working today. So bring these practices that they're using in the open source community back into your organization and benefit from taking the processes that they use on their own time to help them make their lives easier while they're on your time. Another kind of set of philosophical things that you want to think about is you want to ship to learn. You ship software, you test it, you run it through user testing, you run it through security testing, and you learn from that, and then you iterate rapidly. You create feedback loops from your CI/CD deployments, from your customers, from your security tooling to help you iterate more rapidly and have more frequent deployments. If you look at kind of large organizations, some of the most effective organizations in the world have invested in more frequent deployments. Microsoft, in their efforts to increase the way that they focus on intersourcing, have moved from semi-annual ships of software to shipping hundreds or thousands of times a day. The rate at which you can ship software and make incremental change to the code that your customers enjoy both allows you to bring innovation to your customers faster, but on the whole adds to the stability and performance benefits of your software. So moving to a frequent deployment model supported by automation, supported by CI/CD, and supported by the cloud ultimately will help both you and your organization, but also help your customers understand the value and differentiation you're bringing to them. And the last piece of this is developer-focused security. Building security into your workflows in a way that allows not only for your developers to catch vulnerabilities early so they can fix them, but also to give feedback loops so that users are able to more rapidly implement those changes as they're building code. So fix as you build is an important process for developers and developer-focused security. In the end, your philosophy should be to build better software faster. Leverage intersourcing to get the best work out of your developers, to keep your developers happy, and to ensure that you're delivering the best possible experiences to your customers. So I'll close there. As I mentioned, my email is partnerguy@github.com. If you have questions, concerns, comments, or just want to talk about this stuff, please feel free to reach out. My email is open and I'm easy to find, so I'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much for talking with me today about the intersourcing journey, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the online forum, and I look forward to hopefully meeting some or all of you in person someday in the future.
欢迎线上的各位一起跟我回到台北的直播现场哦。从刚刚 Michael 帮我们分享跟这个 GitHub 有关的相关的趋势，我们可以看到台湾的开源社群其实是在全球很厉害的。它除了给我们有很快速的机会，有拿到这个口罩地图之外，它在这个全球还排名第8，是非常活跃的社群哦。那刚刚说的这个口罩地图，其实也是透过了台湾很活跃的这些开发者社群，透过公司协力才可以一起有机会很快的得到这样子的反应。也帮助台湾，其实在这一波全球 COVID-19 都是很严重的打击的疫情之下，我们还可以有很好的防疫表现哦。那说到开源这件事情，我们大概都不意外，学习这个 open source 或者是开源的这个概念或词也超过了20年。那台湾会有这么活跃的开源者社群、开发者社群，其实跟 open source 也绝对有绝对的关系。那刚刚 Michael 在分享里面也提到了，看到很多企业其实都在运用各种 open source 的工具来帮助企业快速开发很多不同的服务哦。那事实上，他在后头提到了一个非常重要的概念，也是其实在 open source 这个概念提出来没有很久，差不多10年，就有提出来的一个概念叫 Intersource。Inner Source 中文我们现在暂时把它翻译叫做内部开源，它比较像是在组织内部可以不管是应用开放原始码的这些工具，或者是类似 Open Source 这些社群在线上合作的时候，所用的这一个方法，就是方法论的这个方法，来在组织内部建立类似 Open Source 的文化，来进一步达成组织想要达成的目标。这是为了我们昨天所提到像 Kubernetes 这样的工具是一样的东西，是当组织发展非常大之后，开发团队也会变大，因为需求变多，架构也变复杂。那这时候我们会希望大家的沟通成本不要太高，有很多的小团队可以出现。那这些小团队来解决了沟通的问题之后，它还是要保持一些特殊的组织文化，然后运用类似 GitHub 这样子的工具来达到组织内部可以不要重复造轮子，然后可以协作、可以沟通的目的。那在这部分，我想跟Tyan讨论看看，因为Tyan有其实从之前到现在，有从小的团队一直成长到大型团队的经验，然后在很多不同的资讯系统开发上面，也开发过大型的系统。在这样的架构之下，你会怎么去看待类似 GitHub 这样子的工具，可以 enable 内部开源的可能性？还有就是依照你的经验，你会怎么提醒台湾的企业决策者，要做内部开源这整件事要注意哪些事
？OK， 这个部分我分成2个层面来回答。那第一个层面是整个组织的管理啊，就是管理层面的部分。然后第二个是这个技术开发的管理，那大概这2个部分。那因为时间有限，我可能挑几个重点。那我在之前有一些演讲里面有分享过这些大型团队组建的一些经验。那我首先就是介绍一下，就组织管理层面，他有提到几个，就是我们要开放、透明、参与、协作跟治理。那通常我们在一个小团队，比如说我先组建一个8个人团队的时候，我会比较在意他的默契。这时候他可能是 full function team， 就是说他可能是很全面的，可能有开发团队，可能有业务的一些需求的人，然后甚至开发又分成前端后端。当然这样一个 完全的团队一个组成，这个大概就像一个企业初期的一个架构。对，那
创业的时候的样子，什么都要会，什么人都有，
对对对，
很小的团队。
对，那我们可能用最小的单位、最小的这个去组成。那我们管理学最大的这个最适合的管理单位大概是8+2，所以我们大概以这个单位为主。好，那在这个单位组成的时候，有一些概念就是虽然说我一开始用这个团队就可以做事情，可是如果接下来慢慢的迭代、慢慢的变化，所以我这边给大家一个东西就是在 GitHub 的软体层面和协作层面其实蛮多，我们等一下再讲工具。但是在组织层面，我觉得第一个阶段做的是文化。那我会把他刚刚的5点，第一个变成是文化，就是开放。开放这件事情为什么叫文化呢？比如说我们今天在做开发，那开放这个原则就会一直在我们这边。比如说我们自己内部的这个开发过程中的相关文件，我们都会共享。这是一个很重要的文化，
不告诉别人你现在正在做什么。
对的，那有的公司可能会因为机密性，所以我各自的团队可能会有一些东西会隐藏，甚至即便是自己，比如说我们都是后端团队，我可能我负责订单的开发，我负责 IN 的即时通讯的开发，各自是看不到的。这个其实是不利于这个技术的交流，所以第一阶段我们要建立的是这个开放的文化，它是一个原则。那这个文化建立是在我们做任何决策讨论的时候，它可以给我们一个准则。OK， 这是第一个。那第二个是从接下来的透明参与跟协作治理，我认为可以用敏捷开发方法论来解。比如说我们用 Scrum，那在 Scrum 的部分我们就会有几个做法，比如说我们在 Planning 的时候，我们就会透明相关的资讯。那在参与的部分，我们透过 Stand Up，就是每日的站立会议去分享我们大概有什么东西，我们今天做了什么，预计做什么，有没有遇到困难？那这个过程中互相的讨论，就会让其他人有机会参与各自面临到的一些问题。OK， 那协作部分会牵扯到比较工具的部分，所以我们后面再讲。最后就是治理，那治理的部分是我们会过来在最后面 Scrum 在 Scrum 的方法论里面，它最后面会有一个 Demo 跟 Retrospective。我认为 Demo 跟 Retrospective 不一定是不是为了检讨，而是为了我们要快速的把我们的东西产出，做一个 feedback， 让我们的利害关系者，让我们的客户，他可以知道说我们做了什么，他觉得还可以变成怎么样，我们快速的去迭代，我们快速的面对市场的变化。透过这样子，那透过这样的部分retrospective， 我们就会讨论说，我们哪里做得好，哪里还可以改进。然后我们应该做什么 action item 去保持我们好的，然后把不好的地方做调整。所以我认为治理的部分，它不像是我们高压的管理，它反而比较像是我们共同的治理。所以我觉得后面部分我用 Scrum 的方式来做一个解析。好，那大概是这样。那回过来组织的建立，刚刚我们只有8个人团队，如果我接下来这个文化顺畅的话，它这个文化和 tempo 会保持下来，接下来我就可以思考下个阶段，也是刚刚这个在 Michael 提到的在组织里面，我们以往可能会用 functional team， 就职能分工比如说后端是一个团队，前端是一个团队，那
DevOps 是一个团队，
对，
全部分开。
是的。那接下来到后面发生的问题就是最近比较讨论比较多的就是谷仓的效应。因为传统这样子分工是好的，那我们可以专注在某件事情。可是，在变化这么多的状况下面，其实我们要做的是不是做这个东西出来？我们要做的是我们要共同 deliver， 我们要共同交付一个价值。那这个价值的过程中，其实只有这个 functional team 是不够的。好，那所以我们就会搭建一个叫做 feature team， 我们叫做功能团队，或者是像他刚刚讲的一个 project team。那这个 team 就会横跨各个单位。那它的好处是，我们在职能分工上面，我们可以针对这个职能的要求去做 coach， 去做指导。那在 project 部分，我们可以针对商业的价值去做最好的提供。所以一个组织会是这样一个矩阵的合作。那这边我可以跟大家分享有几个我们实际上的经验，就是在functional team 这个功能团队，我们会有一些准则。这个准则分工的准则像是我们会让男女有一个平衡。原因是因为男生太多可能不利于工作，如果有一个异性就是中间去让他 balance 的话，其实可以增加这个工作的顺畅程度。
工程师鼓励员
我们还是工作的是。那第二个是我们在资深之前，我们做一个 balance， 所以这个团队它就可以互相学习。OK， 那到后面的部分比如说我们甚至会把一些有些人可能有想法跟没想法，我们互相去 coach。那这个状况这个方式就可以很轻易的应该不能说轻易， 很巧妙的去解决谷仓带来的问题。比如说我一个后端的团队的一个主管，他可能有一些管理的方式，他有一些强项，他有一些弱项。可是在以往的过程中，我可能在升迁的过程中，如果我跟着这个主管，有一些我是看不到的。那我透过这样子合作的过程，它就慢慢可以分开了。这是第一个，我们怎么去组成？
透过矩阵协作的方式，就有机会可以去跟其他主管合作。
是的，那还有一个是也蛮有趣的是，以往的做事方法都是由老板说，我要什么功能去做。那其实，在面对这么快的市场，其实这件事情是不 work 的。那回顾我们开源，其实有很多功能都是大家有了痛点，执行团队面对第一线，所以他提出功能，可能要由下往上推会比较快。
是。
那这时候我们就有一个概念，就是以往做事情是老板说我要组建一个团队，可是以我们的 feature team 啊，我们在比如说其他的大型网络公司，我看到的做法是，他们的做法是，我有一个 PO， 我有想法，我要做某些事情，我不是说老板说了要做。而是我要讲一个故事，吸引这些前端的高手、后端的高手，甚至developers高手，
跟我一起合作，
对，一起合作，对。那这样的话，大家是为了这个东西一起join，然后开发。所以所以在 Michael 的演讲也提到，就是这样的合作的公司里面，它会比较欢乐，比较快乐，那它的流韧性也比较高。我们都知道，现在科技公司其实竞争蛮激烈的，所以流动率也高。但是拥有这样的环境，其实它快乐，然后公司也可以因为它的这样的积累，我们留下更重要的资产。所以我觉得这是在组织层面我们必须要做的。OK， 还有文化层面。那回过来就是，那我怎么管理？我的管理其实回到以前，我们都会想说，工程师是不是要产出多少的code啊，多少的什么东西？然后甚至有的衡量就会说，那我要衡量你多少code大家工程师就会觉得不 make sense 嘛。对，那我们用了这个敏捷方法，我们重新定位到底要交付什么？我们要交付价值。那交付价值，我们会在 demo 的时候去做一个展现。那这是一个。但是如果做久了，我们会发现说，一个技术开发团队如果只 deliver 这个开发的价值、商业的价值，其实有很多技术的价值我就没有办法看到。所以我们这时候我们就会用到像GitLab 或者是其他开源的这样的一个东西。我们会在里面看什么？比如说。在快速开发迭代的过程，我可能以往要3个月才能交付我现在变成1个月交付，甚至我2个礼拜交付。那我的技术要怎么评估？我的技术我就会从我 GitHub 的每一次 code 我都有另外一个人去协同的 review。是。那甚至是每一次在 build 的版本要上线的时候，我都会在里面去看比如说我的 code quality code quality 我会看说程式码的品质，我会看程式自动测试的覆盖率然后是不是有治安的问题，然后甚至到后面上线我要怎么自动化部署，那这些的我都会看。那甚至就我们过往的经验我们这个架构 run 完，其实我们把很多的这种检测，我们交给这种比如说 GitHub 或者是像一些持续整合的一些工具。对，那未来我们就可以把更重要的东西给人做像刚刚讲的，我们可能把 code 的自动化测试交给机器。那时候我们大部分东西都给机器做以后，我们的人就在 review code 的 quality。那时候我们发现，我可以讲一个具体例子，我们发现了所有在程式码的 framework 都有一个简单的写法，说我要怎么去取得第一笔资料对。那大家如果认真去看的话，你们会发现，其实这个写法其实是有治安问题的，就是我们常见的 SQL injection。大家可能会觉得带参数进去好像 make sense， 可是那个东西是可以带恶意的字串进去。是的。所以在很多的 framework 我们那时候没有注意，我们后来把很多东西交给机器，我们去用人类去做最有价的事，我们发现这个非常严重。那透过我们刚刚这个协同合作以后，我们发现以后，我们就有人去把这样检测工具写成补起来。所以那一次我们检测以后，我们确认没有这个治安的议题发生，即便有这个问题，然后我们在当下我们写了一个工具，我们修补了大概有1000多个程式问题。那这个就是我们刚刚讲
更有价值。
是的，我的组织协同合作，我让每个人有技术跟商业的 sense， 然后接下来我透过技术跟工具，让我的技术管理有一个套路，可以视觉化，可以是监控的。那透过这样合作，我们刚刚讲到回顾到前面的几个讲者说，我们要达到平衡，我们达到平衡就是商业跟技术的平衡。那他透过的手段就是我要有组织的建立，然后跟技术的辅助。对。
所以 GitHub 看起来好像是一个我们常见的这所谓的开放原始码，或者是很多开发者常用的工具。可是事实上其实是非常非常多企业的决策者也要熟知的一些相关的工具。然后刚刚Michael 跟志清分享的范围里面都提到这个内部开源的重要性，把人留给更重要的价值，透过开放、透明、参与、协作跟治理的方法。很重要的是，它跟一般的 open source 的不太一样，是 open source 比较像是社群自行治理，但是公司或组织还是有公司或组织的策略或规范，所以还是需要设计一定的规格或者是规则来 run 这一个原则，也才可以达成开发的这个整个 cycle 的目的。那我想这个整个部分，Michael 最后的重点也有提到，内部的开源的这个文化。一定要来自顶层管理者的最大的支持哦，才有办法在这个文化里面有分享、有重用，还有协作跟学习，还有自动的方法。这几个方法其实都是让人回归最本质的价值，然后最终的目的其实是提升开发者的速度，也是我们一直都很关心最重要的价值的问题哦。那很感谢大家透过一整个早上跟我们一起在线上，从学习这个微软的 CEO Satya， 还有相关的其他包含 GitHub、包含 Power App， 还有包含这个 Azure 的最新的更新，还有一些新的方向。然后也很谢谢志清今天有机会带来精彩的对谈分享，让许多洞见都可以让我们在现在有机会去重新思考，无论你是技术人员呢、主管、企业主，甚至是学生，都可以重新好好停下脚步来想想接下来的发展跟布局还有策略哦。那我们昨天跟今天其实提到微软很多种不一样的生产力工具，还有平台的开发或最新的结果。那我想大家可以分别到线上去找到相关的连结，去再进行收听。那微软的这个线上技术峰会，也有其他相关的精彩内容，还有本地的相关的案例或国际案例，值得大家花时间慢慢去一个一个收听哦。然后请大家也在这个整个时间之内，谢谢大家今天的时间。那接下来也请欢迎继续锁定数位时代的官网还有粉丝团，继续关注科技的趋势、技术的动态，然后一起有机会继续学习各种创新的可能。我是数位时代的 James。现在我们 COVID-19 的疫情其实还没有结束，所以希望各位可以跟我一起继续保持健康 ，stay healthy， 一起持续学习。我们很快下次见，谢谢大家。